Greetings, folks. Welcome back to my little corner of the library. The Iliad and the Odyssey are two of the integral pieces of the foundation of Western literature. Almost everyone has heard of them. They've permeated virtually every aspect of pop culture. Books, TV, movies. Classes have been taught about them, papers written, scholars have been debating about them for years. Almost everyone has heard of them, either directly through having read them, or indirectly, simply by being familiar with the stories they contain. The story we're all told in grade school is that the Iliad and the Odyssey were the product of Homer, a blind poet who wandered ancient Greece singing of the Trojan War in exchange for food and shelter. But where did they really come from? Is the story of Homer maybe just a little too simple, maybe just a little too watered down? It's with this in mind that I started digging into the story behind these poems, and that's the story that we're going to talk about today. My name's Dan, this is Bookworm History, and these are the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. The main conflict at the heart of the Iliad and the Odyssey is the Trojan War, the 10-year war between an alliance of ancient Greek city-states trying to regain Helen, the wife of Greek king Menelaus, who had been kidnapped by Trojan prince Paris and brought to Troy. But did it actually happen? Did the war ever happen? Did Troy even exist? Ancient Greeks certainly believed that it happened. Writing in the 3rd century BC, Greek historian and scholar Eratosthenes dated the Trojan War to around 1184 BC, the 12th century BC. Archaeologists have been looking for years to find some evidence of the Trojan War actually taking place, mostly with minimal luck, until 1873, when German amateur archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann, piggybacking mostly on the efforts of archaeologist Frank Calvert, discovered what he said was Troy, near the hill of Hisarlik, in the northwest corner of present-day Turkey. What Schliemann really found, though, was not just one city, but 9. The newest one, Troy 9, had been dated to about 50 BC, whereas the oldest one, Troy 1, had dated to around 3000. Now, Troy 7, the third layer down, going 9, 8, 7, he dated to around 1200 BC. And the city itself, Troy 7, had shown evidence of being destroyed by burning. Everything seemed to fit. The time frame for the war, the fact that the city was located about where it was supposed to be, and that it was destroyed in fire. All of this seemed to suggest that what Schliemann actually found was the Troy of Homeric legend. He had found Homer's Troy. If this is true, and there's still debate among scholars that it actually is, it would suggest that the Trojan War actually took place, or some conflict that later became labeled as the Trojan War, suggesting an actual historical nugget of truth to the Iliad and the Odyssey, which later would be expounded by myth and legend. But what of the legendary poet, the blind, wandering bard Homer? Is there any evidence to support the idea that he actually existed? I mean, the poems exist after all, so someone had to write them. It stands to reason that it could have been one person. But sadly, beyond the poem's existence, we kind of run out of evidence, and all we really have are theories. According to early historians, Homer was born either shortly after the Trojan War, as Aristarchus of Samos says, or he was born in about 800 BC, as Herodotus, writing in about the 4th century BC, would say. But that's a pretty wide gulf, and we don't really have any evidence to support a conclusion one way or another. 7 Greek cities actually vie for the honor of being his birthplace, with no real evidence to narrow it down. Another important factor to consider is that a written alphabet didn't reach Greece until about the 8th century BC. Now, knowing this, let's talk some timelines. We assume the Trojan War took place around 1184 BC, 12th century BC. If Homer was born shortly thereafter, it would mean that he composed the poems, and then they spread through oral tradition for about 300 to 400 years of people, not Homer, telling these stories, before they were actually written down, which means that by the time they were written down, they probably bore little resemblance to an original that Homer had composed. If Homer lived in the 8th century BC, that would mean that there was about 300 to 400 years prior to his birth after the Trojan War, which means that his grasp of the facts and the idea of the Iliad and the Odyssey as a historical document would be somewhat shady. He might have written them down himself, although being blind it seems unlikely. He could have had someone do it for him. But even still, there's about another gulf of 700 or 800 years beyond that before the poems would actually be standardized, before a standard text of the poems would actually be written. And all of this assumes that there is one single person called Homer who wrote these poems, and the evidence would seem to suggest otherwise, or at least would make it unlikely. What is much more likely is that Homer is simply the idea of the embodiment of poetic oral tradition, rather than an individual who composed these poems. An interesting side note is in the work of one American scholar named Milman Parry, who, in the 1930s, found that the tradition of oral poetry had actually survived to modern times. He found that there were several bards in Muslim Serbia, even as late as the 1930s, who told poems and sang songs in a tradition similar to that which we ascribe to Homer. What was also interesting is that upon interviewing several of these bards, he found that there was one poet in particular that they all spoke of, called Isaac, who was supposedly the best of them. He had lived longer than any of them, he knew more songs, he knew more poems, he was able to recite them in a more glorious fashion. But none of these poets had ever actually seen him, much less had any evidence that he existed. And it's far more likely that Homer was born in a similar vein than that he actually was a single person. I think the best way to sum it up is to quote Thomas de Quincey, who, writing in 1847, said, "Some say that there never was such a person as Homer. No such person as Homer. On the contrary, others say, there were scores." So where did the poems come from? The oldest manuscript fragments we have for the Iliad date to around the 3rd century BC, although we do have some quotes out of Plato, who was writing in the 4th century BC. We also have some fragments from the 2nd century BC, and assuming that there is a common origin source, a common ancestor, if you will, for this poem, it would seem to suggest that the fragments should agree with each other. But they don't. They're actually pretty wildly different. Today we have a standardized text, and that's largely thanks to the work of two men, working out of the Library of Alexandria. It all started with Zenodotus of Ephesus, who was actually the library's first custodian. See, he collected as many copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey as he could possibly find, assuming that they all referenced some lost ancestor, although the idea of oral tradition leaves the idea of a common origin as a pretty wide gray area. He took all these copies and began to compare them in terms of chronology and the language used, and began to put together a standardized text. As an interesting side note, it's also theorized that this was the point in time at which the Iliad and the Odyssey were each divided up into 24 books. Each of the poems is composed in 24 books, or chapters, or segments, or whatever you want to call them. And it's theorized that the reason that they're done this way, and that all of the books are approximately the same length, is because this was one of the first times they were written down in a standard version, and there was a physical limitation to how much text you could actually fit on a papyrus scroll. While Zenodotus began the process of standardization, he would later pass the banner to Aristarchus, another scholar working in the library, who would, along with completing the process of standardization, actually add commentary and criticism. He would actually critique the work. He would identify sections that didn't seem to fit because of language or chronology, which most modern scholars actually tend to agree with, that these sections were simply later additions and don't date back as far as some other sections, lending credence to this idea that there was not actually a single common source, but that the poems were composed gradually by many people over time. Now, I know a lot of what I've talked about today is pretty ambiguous, but the truth is, we really just don't have the answers. It'd be nice to think that tomorrow archaeologists would stumble across a tomb in Greece with a big sign over the door saying, "Here lies Homer, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey," that inside would be remains dating to an appropriate time period along with manuscript copies of the Iliad and the Odyssey. But the truth is, it's pretty darn unlikely. To say nothing of the fact that if Homer actually did exist, he was a poor wandering blind bard, and when he died probably wasn't given all that much pomp and circumstance, but never mind that. I think ultimately the important thing is that the poems do exist, and that after over 2,000 years they continue to inspire and amaze. I think that Homer, as far as he ever existed, exists as much as he needs to within the collective minds of the people that read his works and continue to be inspired by them. That's all I've got for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. Be sure to hit that subscribe button down below so you stay up to date on all of our latest episodes. Again, I really just scratched the surface of the Iliad and the Odyssey. If you want more information, I would highly recommend checking out the Iliad and the Odyssey, a biography by Alberto Manuel. It goes into a lot of detail about not only the history of the Iliad and the Odyssey, but also their impact on culture and society today. As always, you can find us over at our website, bookwormhistory.com. Feel free to browse through our playlists and some of our previous episodes. I hope you like what you find. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and thanks for stopping by.